Hello everyone. So, year-end lists are coming out soon, but first, let's talk about Bloodborne and its soundtrack. Now, Bloodborne is a game that I've played recently. I've already completed it 3 times in a row, back to back to back, and I've also gotten the Platinum Trophy. I already consider this to be one of my favorite games of all time. I made my first tier list video a few months ago with the soundtrack of Nier Automata, and my next step was actually to talk about the Dark Souls trilogy soundtrack. However, I have the least experience with Dark Souls 2 since I've only completed it once, and there were certain few fights that I haven't encountered them, so I wanted to wait a little bit more, playing the game again eventually sometime, and then talk about the Dark Souls trilogy. But at this point I want to talk about the Bloodborne soundtrack, which out of everything I've played from software games so far, this is possibly my favorite soundtrack yet. I haven't played Demon's Souls, I haven't played Sekiro and Elden Ring, but from everything else I've played, I really enjoy the Bloodborne soundtrack. I believe that it's a massive improvement in comparison to what we saw with Dark Souls 1 and 2 in terms of the compositions and the whole arrangements and actually the whole sound design. I believe that in the cases of Dark Souls 1 and 2, there were certain aspects with instrumentation and the way it would sound that it would feel somewhat cheap, which is something that is not really the case with Bloodborne. It is the first case where it actually really feels epic with some really nice production with the songs and the classical instrumentations. So I believe that Bloodborne feels like a step up in terms of its compositions and arrangements, and I believe that it contains some of the greatest themes that we get in the Soulsborne series. Still though, this list is probably not gonna go like the Nier Automata one, in which I praised a huge portion of the songs. In this one I believe the tiers would feel slightly more balanced. Now thankfully I've already found a pretty decent already existing tier list of the soundtracks. I don't really need to create one from scratch just like I did with Nier Automata, and thankfully it includes the DLC bosses soundtracks as well because I wanted to talk about them as well. I've put them in the order just like the track list on Spotify, then we have the DLC bosses and we have those three apparently. I don't really know why, because the Hunter is there, the Watchers is there, and then there is also that, so I don't really know what those three are, but don't pay attention to them. So let's just jump straight to it. At first we have Omen. Now this is more of like a cinematic theme, an introduction, which is pretty unnecessary. I mean, in the context of having visuals to it, it feels fine, but as a standout song, it's just really forgettable. There is not really something that much about it, so I'm gonna put it at the bottom over here at the F tiers are not included once again, just like with the Nier Automata video, because I don't really believe that there is anything in the soundtrack that I would consider bad. It's just that with the D tier, it's tracks that I find them to be forgettable. Now we have the Night Unfurls. Now this is the one that you get in the main menu theme, and I'd say that this is possibly, out of everything that I've played so far from software games, I personally prefer this over all of the three main menu themes in the Dark Souls trilogy. I find the atmosphere out of this to be really nice. I like how it starts with this really more moody atmospheric tone, and the climax with the finisher towards the end is actually kinda unexpected. It is really dynamic and it goes into a direction that I believe it's kinda surprising. It catches you off guard and it makes for a really nice, impactful moment. I actually really dig this main menu theme, and I'd put it at A tier. Hunter's Dream. Now this is a really beautiful soothing theme. It is the one that you get in the character customization screen, and it is the one that you get in a pretty big portion when you're in the Hunter's Dream. Interestingly enough, I'd say out of all the sort of hub areas that you get out of the games, like with Dark Souls 1 and 2 and 3, I'd say that Bloodborne is possibly my least favorite out of everything in the Dark Souls trilogy when it comes to those themes, which for me were amazing. But still, what we get with Hunter's Dream is certainly one of the better tracks. I really like the atmosphere of this, how melancholic it is, it has some beautiful melodies, and the overall structure is still pretty nicely crafted. And surprisingly enough, I find what we get with the Dark Souls trilogy in terms of hub areas to be so spectacular that even this theme doesn't really manage to surpass them, but I still believe that it fits really nice with the atmosphere that the Hunter stream creates, and yeah, I would put it in a high A tier over here. Now here's where we go into some great stuff. We have the Hunter. Now I'd say that Father Gascoigne not only is such a great boss fight, it is an amazing starting point boss fight, but I'd also say that the soundtrack is spectacular. I'd say that this is one of my favorite epic themes that we get out of boss music. Usually my favorite themes when it comes to Dark Souls tracks is ones that are more minimal and melancholic. This is why some of my favorite themes are Farlek's Shrine, Majula, the Gwyn theme. I still found certain boss themes to be fine, but this is where it really picks up. Father Gascoigne has an amazing boss theme. It is intense, it is executed very nicely, it is really well performed. I'd say that when it has the transition to the werewolf and we get to the second theme, while it's more intense and it's more pumped up and more like anxiety inducing, I'd say that what we get with melodic portions out of the very first phase with those string arrangements, it's undoubtedly one of the greatest stuff that we've gotten out of any FromSoft game in terms of soundtrack. This is deserving of an S tier. I believe that this is a great theme and certainly one of the most memorable and best ones that I've heard in any of those games. And now we also get into another theme that I find to be absolutely spectacular, the Cleric Beast. I'd say that this is the greatest epic track they've done in any of those boss fights. Period. Out of every one of the games that I've played so far, this is my favorite. This is so spot on. A very distinct, memorable and standout melody that is nicely repeated through different structures and arrangements, and it makes for such an epic, impactful and powerful theme. This is the main thing that made the Cleric Beast and Amelia some of the most standout fights in this game, is this spectacular soundtrack. This for me is peak when it comes to everything FromSoft related. This is how you make an epic theme. You make a standout melody that manages to repeat itself and even progress with multiple more arrangements. The choral, the choir portions sound fantastic. This is an excellent theme. Now we get the Blood-Starved Beast. Now this one starts in a more sort of creepy and tense note in comparison to what we got with the previous two boss fights. Now I'd say that it fits with this particular boss as it has this kinda mysterious and horrifying design to it. Like when you first encounter the Blood-Starved Beast, it feels more mysterious and weird in comparison to the previous two bosses, and I believe that the tone it creates towards the beginning is pretty spot on. After this point we get some more melodic and epic portions, which I can't really say they necessarily fit that much amazingly with the whole build up. It doesn't really connect that much in my opinion, and it doesn't necessarily make for one of the greatest and most standout ideas out of the soundtrack. I still believe though that it is a pretty good theme. I like some of the melodic portions. I believe that there are some quite nice elements when it comes to the arrangement, so I'm gonna put it at the B tier, finding this to be just a pretty decent soundtrack. The track Terror is actually one that we get into the Chalice Dungeons. It is the one that, if I remember correctly, we get when you fight Watchdog of the Old Lords, which actually I find to be one of the better fights out of the Chalice Dungeons. And the thing that makes this fight so much better in my opinion is this great soundtrack. It is actually surprising that in my opinion they actually ended up using one of their best boss themes in an optional area. Like for me, the Chalice Dungeons had some great original stuff, but in order to get through the good parts you have to spend so many hours into like doing the same thing and fighting the same enemies over and over again, which is a bit unfortunate, but I believe Chalice Dungeons had some great ideas to them, had some great new elements that were worth checking out. And I believe that one of the better things out of the Chalice Dungeons was this incredible epic boss theme with some of the coolest and most intense choirs out of everything else in the soundtrack. It is a really powerful, really impactful theme, and I would definitely put it as one of my favorites when it comes to boss themes. I believe that this is a hidden gem, and also because Watchdog is actually a pretty cool boss fight, and it's one that you can encounter pretty early in the Chalice Dungeon. So yeah, I believe that this is one of the better themes when it comes to boss music. The sort of epicness and the intensity out of it makes for a pretty impactful moment. So I'm gonna put it right here at A tier in between Hunter's Dream and The Night Unfurls. Now we have the Watchers. Now I believe that outside of the boss era, when you hear the soundtrack, I believe that you hear it in a big portion in the Chalice Dungeons, which is mostly how I remember this theme. Now this starts pretty nicely with those string arrangements. I believe that it's a really nice sort of creepy theme, but after this point it becomes like this kind of really epic theme. But beside that, I don't really believe that there is anything that much memorable with this song. I believe that there are some really cool elements to it. I remember it being a really nice soundtrack in terms of some of its melodic aspects in certain elements, but it's definitely not one of the most standout moments when it comes to the overall soundtrack. So I'm gonna put it beneath Bloodstarved Beast at B tier. Hell the Nightmare. Now this is a theme that I wanted to see more in these games, not only in Bloodborne but in the Dark Souls trilogy in general. I believe that one of the most lacking themes when it comes to those games is music in areas outside of boss arenas. When you explore an area, I get it how they put the focus in sound design and checking your surroundings and stuff, but I believe that stuff like this, like what we get with Hell the Nightmare, which sounds so much in the background, and also when you get into certain points throughout the area, it sounds more muffled or it sounds louder and stronger. I believe that elements like this elevate the experience much more, and I would hope that we would get more out of those games. But the fact that we still get it in Bloodborne is such a nice and refreshing surprise, because we get it very rarely. Hell the Nightmare is a really cool choral theme with some really nice choirs that create such a dark and haunting atmosphere, which is pretty fitting with the mysterious entrance on the Hypogean Gaol. I can't really know how to pronounce this place, but the thing is that Hell the Nightmare manages to be a very standout song for just being different in comparison to what you would expect getting into this game. And I believe that it also sounds pretty nice. It is minimal and it is pretty standout. So for me, Hell the Nightmare goes into a pretty strong A tier. I would say I would put it right here below Terror. I believe that this is a really nice theme. Dark Beast with the boss fight Dark Beast Pearl. In terms of design and soundtrack, this is definitely one of the most standout boss fights. I believe that there are some great elements when it comes to Dark Beast Pearl, which is kinda unfortunate that the fight itself was definitely not one of the best. I believe that it was a nice boss fight, but in terms of like the actual mechanics of the boss fights, it was certainly not one of the most standout. It felt slightly lacking in comparison to what we got with the design and also with a great boss theme, which I'd say it also manages sort of like with Terror to go into some similar directions, just being like really intense and having some really cool standout melodies. Now this one I believe takes a little bit more in order to get those certain points. I believe that it's not like the most compelling in terms of like its overall pacing, as it has a few build-ups that might take a while since you reach a certain point of like some great stuff, but I still find this to be a really good boss theme, and I would put it, I believe, like right here in like the lowest of A tiers. The Witch of Hemwick, I really don't think much about this boss fight, and I also don't really think much about the boss theme, which I find it to be possibly one of the most forgettable out of the whole series. It is an easy fight, it doesn't really get that much long in order to get into it, and I don't really believe that the soundtrack over here does anything particularly special. It builds some intensity, it has this element of like anxiousness, trying to fight the witches at first as you don't really know what you're doing, but outside of that, I don't really believe that the theme builds up into anything all that special. I'd say that this is one of the most forgettable boss themes that we get out of the game, and I would put it at a D tier. Next we have Amygdala. Now this is a theme that I expected it to be somewhat more promising, considering that Amygdala plays a big role into the game, being into multiple different places, and having to fight it as a boss. I believe that it's a pretty nice and compelling boss fight, but I believe that one of my least favorite elements about the Amygdala boss fight ended up being the soundtrack, since I'd say it was definitely not one of the most memorable, and I expected a bit more out of it. I'd say that it starts kinda nice with some of the string sections, and there are a few places where we get some pretty nice climactic tones, but they don't really seem to last that long. It is a bit all over the place, and I'd say that there are a few nice ideas here and there, but there are in just many different sporadic locations throughout the soundtrack, and yeah, I don't really believe that it makes for one of the strongest boss themes. I'd say that I'd put it over here at C tier. Next is Rom the Vacuum Spider. Now, I'd say that I actually really like this theme. I like the dark atmosphere we get towards the beginning, which is really soothing, and I'd say it feels really nicely with this really vast and big lake that is just endless, and the very first phase of this fight is pretty chill for the most part if you know what you're doing, and when Rom is pretty passive herself. Then we get the second phase where Rom actually starts to attack with projectile and arcane and magic attacks, in which we see the theme getting much more intense, but it doesn't really reach a point where it feels over the top. It still manages to keep the dark, ominous and eerie atmosphere that was building up from the beginning, and I believe that this makes for one of the most interesting themes, because I like that there is this balance of like keeping some of the more atmospheric parts even when the track becomes more intense with some of its additional instrumentations. So for me, I believe that there are many great elements about the Rom boss fight when it comes to the soundtrack. So I'm gonna put it over here at an A tier. I'm gonna put it right here. Yeah, right here, I'd say. Next up is Moonlit Melody, which is the second theme that you get into the Hunter's Dream. You first listen this theme the very first time you visit the Hunter's Dream, and then you listen to it for the rest of the game after you finish the fight with Rom, and the whole world has just shifted into something much different. Moonlit Melody, I'd say, it doesn't really manage to be as much compelling in comparison to the Hunter's Dream. There are still some really nice and beautiful elements. It is another pretty melancholic, soothing and smooth theme, but I'd say that the ideas over here didn't really manage to captivate me as much, so I'm gonna put it at a high B tier. The One Reborn is one of those cases where I believe that we get a boss fight that the fight itself wasn't really that much spectacular, even though I liked some of its more unique ideas, and I believe that we also don't get one of the more standout soundtracks. I believe that with the case of the One Reborn, it contains many elements that we've seen with previous tracks being done better beforehand. So there is not really that much to say about this particular theme. I don't really believe that many people remember it that much anyway, so I'm gonna put it over here at C tier. Mikolas, the Nightmare Host. Now this is an interesting one. I know that this is a fight that most people don't really like it, and I can pretty much understand why. There were a few elements with its mechanics that were certainly quite goofy. I might feel indifferent towards the fight, but I'd say that what is arguably one of the best elements about this fight is the soundtrack. I actually really like this theme because I believe that it fits really nicely with the overall atmosphere that Mikolas creates with this world and this arena that has put here in order to confuse you and just create this nightmarish trap in which you can't really escape and you have to find a way to make it eventually stop. So I'd say that there are some really nice elements when it comes to this boss theme because it feels kinda different with some of the instrumentation choices that it has. I also believe that in the way it sounds at times it contributes to the goofy nature of this boss fight, and interestingly enough I'd say that Mikolas contains one of the most standout boss themes out of every boss in Bloodborne. It is kinda unique, it feels slightly refreshing, and I believe that it fits nicely with the overall theme that this boss creates with its area and its environment. So I'll put it at a pretty high A tier, like over here, like below Terror and above Hail the Nightmare. Of the Thumerian line is a track that you get in the Chalice dungeons. I believe that most notably in the fights with the Thumerian Descendant and the Thumerian Elder, which I find it to be pretty cool boss fights. The soundtrack itself, it's simply okay. It has some nice elements when it comes to some of the string sections towards the beginning, as they have this more moody, dark and creepy tone to them, but as the track progresses and goes on, I don't really believe that it makes for that much of an amazing development. So with that being said, I believe that this just stands at a C tier, like right over here. Queen of the Vile Bloods, I believe that this is the theme that you get when you fight Martyr Logarius, which I'd say that the boss fight itself was really cool. However, I believe that the soundtrack is kinda forgettable. I don't really think that the soundtrack contains that many amazing elements to it, something that is that much stand out. It is a pretty cool, epic theme, and I believe that it's just another case where we've heard better stuff out of the soundtrack beforehand. This one doesn't really make that much of its own. I believe that this is another C tier soundtrack. Now, Soothing Hymn is a track that the last thing I would consider and call it is soothing. This is the creepiest theme that you get out of the game. It's the one that you get when you reach the Upper Cathedral Ward, which is another case of the track that I would hope we would get more out of this, not only Bloodborne but also in the Dark Souls trilogy. I don't really believe that this one has the impact of Hail the Nightmare, as this one has many silent portions to it. It only comes and goes in certain parts, just building this tension with those ominous strings. It's mostly just like a horror theme, and it doesn't really extend into that much beyond that, mainly because it's just a few portions here and there when you listen to some sounds, and it just creates this tension, this tense atmosphere, which for what it is, it works pretty nice, containing this more dark theme to it, but apart from that I'm just gonna put it at a B tier over here. The Celestial Emissary, just like with The Witch of Hemwick, is another case of a pretty forgettable boss fight with a pretty forgettable boss theme as well. Now, I'd say that I don't really believe that there is anything that much in terms of like a build up or something more intense with this boss theme. It mostly extends to like the same structures. I don't really remember that much out of this particular fight in terms of its music. It was pretty forgettable, certainly not one that I believe many people really consider this as one of the best soundtracks, so I believe that I'm gonna put it over here at D tier. Next up, we have Ebrietas, Daughter of the Cosmos. Now, I'd say that there are some really nice elements about this particular track that I really enjoy, and I believe that it makes for some of the better moments out of the soundtrack in general. But as a whole thing, I believe that it sort of misses the mark in particular occasions. It is a bit of an overwhelming song, like it has many things going on to it, and I don't believe that every single thing that it does lands perfectly. So I'd say that this is a track that it has its moments, but it's one of those moments that as a whole thing I believe that there is so much going on to it that it doesn't really manage to stand out that much outside of certain portions. I still believe that it's a really good theme, but outside of that I believe that I'm gonna put it on a B tier right below Moonlit Melody. Lullaby for Mergo, or Mergo's Wet Nurse boss theme. Now, this is a legitimately horrifying theme and a horrifying boss. I'd say that this is effectively the most unsettling fight out of the game. It's not just with very weird Mergo's Wet Nurse design, but we actually get something quite refreshing and unique when it comes to the soundtrack over here, and I really like when those games end up just making something somewhat different, something that would manage to stand out. And this is the case with Mergo's Wet Nurse over here, because what we get as a soundtrack is simply a music box. And that's pretty much it. There is nothing more to it like any orchestra or choirs behind it. It's simply just a music box. It is a really minimal, effective, straight to the point melody, and I believe that in this case it just works tremendously. It makes for something different, something unique, it catches you off guard, and it manages to be unsettling. And this is something that happens with music boxes. They have the tendency, they end up being in many horror tropes, and there is something about their sound, something about their aesthetic that manages to make them feel like horrifying, make you have this unsettling feel towards them. And it certainly doesn't help how in this fight you also have this music box playing, you have this weird entity of a boss, and you also have a baby constantly crying in the background while you step on cracked bones. So yeah, all of those images and sounds combined makes the soundtrack like really stand out and one of the most unique and most refreshing moments out of everything they have done. This is an effectively unsettling song. I would put it like below Hail the Nightmare over here. Now, the first hunter, the German boss fight. This is considered, and I can understand why, it's considered for a lot of people to be one of the greatest themes out of the game. And yeah, I can see why, because this is definitely the saddest theme out of everything else that we've heard in Bloodborne so far. Like, there are a few parts out of the soundtrack where you could say it has this sort of more dark and melancholic mood to it, but nothing really reaches the intensity, the tension, and having the string arrangements that we get out of this particular theme, which I'd say it is really nicely done, it's nicely executed, and I'd also say it's one of the main occasions where you can see the soundtrack differentiating in terms of quality in comparison to what we got with Dark Souls 1 and 3. I believe that the overall arrangements, how polished it sounds, the compositions, it is like on another level when it comes to like being really well produced. With that being said though, I can't really say that it's one of my personal standout themes, but I recognize its quality and why it's considered one of the best. But for me, I would put it below Rome. I would put it at like a low A tier theme. Final boss out of the main game is the secret boss for the secret ending, the Moon Presence. What an unsettling theme for definitely one of the most unsettling fights in the entire game. There is something really mysterious and just wacky about the design of the moon presence. I just really surprised how they came up with this idea, because this is just a sick design. Now, when it comes to this track, the thing with moon presence is that I haven't really had that much of an experience with it, because I've only beaten it once in order to get the secret ending, and it was also kind of an easy fight. I beat it in my first try. I don't really believe that the moon presence poses that much of a challenge outside of its design and how threatening it looks. Outside of that, the boss fight was certainly pretty interesting, but one that didn't really last long, and the soundtrack ended up not leaving that much of a lasting impression on me. I've listened to it more in order to pick up some of its elements, and I'd say that it works in the effect of being unsettling. Beyond that, I can't really say that it's one of my favorite themes, but I'd still put it in like a high C tier. Finally, out of the main game, we have the self-titled track, the credits, which as a credits theme, I'd say it makes its job well done. It obviously works much better in the context of the game, just like when you've completed it and you see the credits roll. As its own theme, obviously there is not really that much to it, but still I find it to be a pretty decent and okay ending credits theme, and I would put it at like the top of the C tier. Alright, enough messing around. It's time to talk about what is possibly the moment you've all been waiting for: Ludwig the Accursed and Ludwig the Holy Blade. Is this one of the greatest soundtracks FromSoft has ever done? Yes. Yes, it is. This one actually took me a while to really get into it, but the moment it clicked, it made so much sense. This was a huge grower on me, and I find this to be like a spectacular boss theme. It's so epic, and there are so many good elements about it. I mean, I know that most people talk about the second half with the second phase when it has this really amazing climactic portion, but I'd honestly say that the first phase still stands pretty nicely on its own. It has some really cool elements to it. I definitely enjoy this track as a whole. In my opinion, it's really well put together. And also the transitional point when you get from the first phase to the second one, also having what is arguably the greatest cutscene they've ever created. Like, at least from everything I've played, okay, Dark Souls 1, 2, 3 and Bloodborne. This is the best cutscene over here. The way it transitions with the melody, with the Gregorian chants, and then you have this epic thing just going on, being bombastic, being so over the top, being so intense. It is just fantastic. Now, there are so many videos of classical composers reacting to this theme, so they can do a much better job on explaining why this track kicks ass. But yeah, I'm gonna put it at an S tier. But actually, I'm gonna put it lower than Cleric Beast and Father Gascoigne, which you might find this as a hot take, but for me, the impact out of those particular themes is something that is simply unmatched. Don't get me wrong, a great theme, okay, it is an S tier, but those two just simply unmatched in my opinion. Next up out of the DLC bosses is the Living Failures. Now, I believe that for most people, the Living Failures was possibly the most sort of underwhelming DLC boss. I still like the boss, but it definitely didn't really have that much to it. The thing with the soundtrack out of this one is that I believe that it's more over the top and more epic than what it needed to be. I mean, looking at this particular boss fight, the mechanics of the fight and the design don't really indicate me that a theme like that would feel that much fitting, so it kind of misses the mark in this regard in my opinion. But still, the thing is that I believe that as a boss theme, it's fine, it's pretty cool. I don't really believe that there is anything particularly special about it. I just find it to be pretty fine, and one that just feels slightly disconnected with what we get with the actual fight. But with that being said, I'm just gonna put it at like a C tier, not being one of the most standout soundtracks out of the game. I'm gonna put it below Amygdala. Next up is Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. I believe that there are some quite cool elements about this track. I like the beginning, how it has this more tense feel to it, how it slowly builds up, and then we get some pretty cool epic moments as the track goes on, but I can't really say that consistently it's one of the better themes. I'd say that it's another one of those occasions where it has certain portions that sound really good, but as a whole theme, I believe that when it comes to some of its structures and its pacing, it doesn't really do the greatest job. It takes a while to reach certain points. Still though, very nice, tense theme, fitting for such an intense boss fight as well. But considering how great this boss fight is, I believe that the soundtrack could have been even better in my opinion. Still, I'm gonna put it at like a high B tier. It's still like a really good song. Then we have Orphan of Course, which is, I'd say, possibly the most challenging boss out of the game, and also my personal favorite one. I love the mechanics out of this fight, how intense it is, how it constantly has you at the edge of your seat. It is such a ruthless and relentless boss fight, and I absolutely love it. It felt so good, such a great achievement managing to beat Orphan of Course. It is definitely one of the greatest boss fights I've ever done. Now, in terms of the soundtrack, it starts with a really moody tone, like it starts really depressing, which I'd say really fits the theme considering how depressing the arena looks, the whole setting, the screams that the Orphan of Course constantly makes. It is like agony listening to it. And yeah, I believe that the moody atmospheric tone towards the beginning makes a pretty nice job on conveying those emotions. Then we have the second phase where it gets much more intense, where we get a really epic theme. I can't really say that they connect that much greatly, like it feels inconsistent going from one point to the next. They don't feel like they have that much of a strong connection to them, but still when the second phase music comes, it is like really intense, like you know shit's about to go down. And I believe that both themes, respectfully, even though they don't really feel that they have that much of a connection to them, they're really strong in their own terms, and I believe that they make a really nice job capturing the essence of this fight. So for me, there are many great elements about this boss music, and I'm gonna put it pretty high up there. I'm gonna put it below the Hunter's Dream at the A tier. And finally, we have Lawrence. Now, this one is a soundtrack that shares elements that you would get from the Cleric Beast and the Amelia boss fight, which makes sense. It is of kind of the same theme, and you basically, I'd say, get a bit of a lesser version out of what we got with the Cleric Beast soundtrack. It feels more slowed down, it has a bit of a different structure, and I like having this same theme, but it doesn't really feel that much more impactful in my opinion. After this similar beginning though, it feels like the track ends up finding its own identity and becoming its own thing, and basically becoming much more epic and having its own unique elements, which I'd say that they sound nice, but I can't really say that it's one of my favorite themes. And this might feel like a hot take because I believe that many people really love this particular soundtrack, like the Lawrence theme, but I can't really say it was one of the most memorable ones for me, one of the greatest. I still really recognize its quality and some of its really good elements, but I wouldn't really put it that much up there. I would put it like below the Ebrietas fight, I'd say, over here. And that's basically all for my ranking, the tier list of the Bloodborne soundtrack. I personally really love this game. It's definitely one of the greatest gaming experiences I've ever had. Obviously, if you do have a PS4, it is the strongest suggestion I can make out of every game the console has. Hopefully there might be a time where we can see this ported to PC, so more people would end up having access to it, because I believe that it's certainly worth it. Giving this game a shot, it's really worth it, even though I recognize that this is certainly not for everyone, but it's such a top tier quality game, and I'd say that the soundtrack is mostly pretty serviceable, if not great. I believe that there are some amazing themes, like the S tier is definitely some of the best tracks they've ever done in FromSoft games, in my opinion. And yeah, let me know your thoughts and what do you think about the Bloodborne soundtrack. Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.